Is debt beating you down? You need discipline. You need the Debt Ninja. If you've been caught in a financial trap and need to be set free, then you need the Debt Ninja. Want to stop those harassing collection calls? Start saving thousands in interest and fees and get out of debt fast? Then you need to call the Debt Ninja. The Debt Ninja will find the best companies across the country that will help you consolidate all your bills into one easy payment, reduce your payments by 30 to 50%, and get you out of debt fast. If you have unsecured debt of $10,000 or more, such as credit cards, loans, or medical bills, call the Debt Ninja for a free 15-minute consultation.
Call 800-826-1246. 800-826-1246. That's 800-826-1246. Call today.
The Debt Ninja.
Individuals and businesses with tax problems, listen carefully. Do you feel like you're losing control over your finances? If you owe over $10,000 in back taxes or have unfiled tax returns, we can help you take back control. The IRS is the largest and most aggressive collection agency in the world, and they can seize your bank account, garnish your paycheck, close your business, and file criminal charges. Take control of your tax problems now by calling the experts at Tax Mediation Services and take advantage of the Fresh Start program and new laws that may allow us to negotiate a settlement for the lowest amount possible. Our team of tax attorneys and enrolled agents can stop collections and get you protected so you can take control of your financial future. Tax Mediation Services is accredited by the Better Business Bureau. Call now for a free case review and a price protection guaranteed quote.
Call Tax Mediation Services now at 800-610-9050. That's 800-610-9050. 800-610-9050.
All writers are prone to becoming so attached to our characters and stories that we struggle to see why a passage may not be working. It takes another set of eyes to help us nurture our writing into full maturity. At Black Wolf Editorial Services, we strive to enable writers to develop and grow, shaping stories into masterpieces that can stand the test of time. Editing services are provided for all genres and all age categories. Services range from critiques of the short story through to line edits of the full-length novel and copy editing for those preparing for publication. We also offer assistance on generating a writer's bio for your websites, as well as help with those book blurbs and promotional material. We won't abandon you to the masses. We want to celebrate with you in your successes. Black Wolf Editorial Services, nurturing your writing into maturity. For a full list of services and prices, visit us at blackwolfeditorial.com.
This is Slickery Trigger for Rebel Road Tactical. With proper care and feeding, your pistol will be ready when you need it. There to save your life. Shouldn't your gear be that good? Whether you need a holster for comfortable everyday carry or a tough-as-nails holster for your next training course, Rebel Road Tactical has what you need. Check us out on the web at rebelroadtactical.com.
You're listening to the Spark Radio Network, internet radio like you've never heard before. Innovation, creativity, and imagination are all said to begin with a spark. So fasten your seatbelt and take the ride of your life and listen for the spark.
You are listening to KLRN Radio, where liberty and reason still reign.
My name is Jessie. I'm a United States Special Forces widow. This gives me a unique perspective on the world around us. If you're willing to listen, I'll tell you how I see it, and I won't pull any punches. This is my POV, which stands for point of view.
Alright, this is Jessie. I am so happy to be back with you guys. You know I miss you when we're not talking. Alright, I'm not alone today. It's Saturday Slowdown. You know I often have guests on Saturday Slowdown. Now, I am joined today by Justin Kinney, who is a PhD student studying the psychology of terrorism, as in what makes the terrorists do what they do. and he's got a really cool topic for us today. How you doing today, Justin?
I'm doing well, Jesse. It's good to be back.
Oh, glad to have you. Always glad to have you. So what do you have in store for us today?
Well, I thought it'd be a good time to talk about some of the history behind terrorism. We often think about these religious groups as being inherently violent and terroristic in nature, but really these groups have kind of co-opted that terrorism as a strategy from groups that go back decades with roots that go back even centuries.
Okay, wait a minute. So terrorism wasn't always based in religion? They didn't always go hand in hand?
Not always. We've seen several different waves over the years. Even in the last couple hundred years, we've seen it go through several different changes, from anarchist groups to communist groups as well.
Okay, now that's interesting because, of course, like the rest of the country nowadays and the rest of the world nowadays, I think terrorism, the first group that comes to mind is ISIS, which can also be referred to as ISIL or Daesh, and I often call them Daesh on my show because, well, I don't want to give them any kind of statehood or caliphate recognition. So that's fascinating. So where did all this start, and how did it get its start?
Well, it goes back, as I said, centuries and to the very roots. We had a couple of groups in the first century, the Sicarii, which was kind of an assassination style group that was all about kicking the Romans out of Jerusalem and kind of the modern day Israel and Palestine. We saw some groups over the centuries the Nizari Ismailis had a group called the Hashashin, which were another group that showed some aspects of terrorism. The Tugis in India as well. But we didn't actually see the word terrorism pop up until the 1700s. And even then, it wasn't the way we think about it today. It was used during the French Reign of Terror. It actually began as a method for Maximilien Robespierre to consolidate government power. So it was used by the government in those days against the people, against those who resisted their rule and threatened them. And that's where we first see the word terrorism pop up.
Okay, so wait a minute. Terrorism was first used by the government to threaten the people, not the people to create anarchy.
Absolutely, yeah. Robespierre executed well over 10,000 people who were perceived as showing resistance to the revolution. And it was all about establishing his dictatorship.
That is fascinating. The number of people makes me think of Lenin and Stalin.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The reign of terror in France was brutal. They killed a lot of people who were perceived as being resistant to their cause.
All right. So this goes all the way back, you're saying, to the 17th and 18th centuries? That's incredible.
It is. And like I said, it started kind of as this government move, but kind of around the 1880s, we saw it take a shift, and it actually began to be used against the government. And that really began with the Narodnaya Volya, who was they're a Russian terrorist group, kind of a revolutionary group that assassinated Tsar Alexander II in 1881. That was really the first time we saw terrorism, like the way that we think about it in modern times, being used by the people against the government.
Wow. Okay, so terrorism as we think about it in modern times didn't come about till you said, what, the 1800s?
The late 1800s, about 1880 or so.
Wow, that is fascinating. So, I mean, like I said, I've being a student of history and a fascination with news, I've gone back and I've even seen, okay, it used to be when terrorists would go in, they'd just shoot a place up, whoever they killed, but they wouldn't kill themselves. They may get killed in the takedown or get killed in the end, but they weren't setting off bombs. They were usually shooting places up. And also, if they hijacked an airliner, they were trying to get to some freaky country that wasn't easy to get to. And nowadays, it just seems like terrorist attack equals death. Has it always equaled death?
It's gone through some waves. This wave that started in the 1880s actually used a lot of assassinations, and they used a lot of dynamite and bombings because that was what was cheap and easily available. But as you mentioned, you're talking about more of the third wave when you get into kind of the new left communist groups, where we started to see the hijackings rise. And those type of so-called shoot 'em up cases. But it's really gone through several different transitions over the years. It's changed drastically in a lot of ways.
Okay, so if that was the third wave, what was the first wave?
Yeah, so the first wave is called the anarchist wave. This is using a man named David Rappaport's his classification system. But the anarchist wave ran for about 40 years, from 1880 to 1920, and it was all about seeking to be revolutionaries, destroying the government, destroying bureaucracy, liberating humanity. It really spawned out of this Narodnaya Volia group in Russia. But it led to kind of a series of assassination attempts of leaders throughout the world. They often call this period the golden age of assassination. And I think they averaged about one major European minister or head of state being assassinated or attempting to be assassinated about every 18 months for quite a while there. There was a Spanish prime minister, an Italian king. We're probably most familiar with Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who led to World War I. But even President McKinley here in the United States is probably part of that wave, where you saw these revolutionary groups trying to assassinate government leaders.
Okay, so their main goal was to basically assassinate one person. They weren't out to kill as many as they could. They were after a target.
Yeah, they specifically targeted individual people, but I would say their ultimate goal was to destroy governments in general. I mean, they're called the anarchist wave for a reason. They were much more about, sending power back to the people and ultimately eliminating governments.
Okay, so did they want a complete elimination of government or just certain aspects of it, or did they want free and total anarchy?
That gets a little tricky, depending on which group you're talking about. I would say they wanted to kind of destroy the conventions of government as they saw them, because they thought they were oppressing humanity. My best guess is they weren't against government entirely, but they really wanted to just send a lot of the power, if not all of it, back to the people who were under the rule of these empires.
Okay, so they really didn't want a government. I don't want an oppressive government. I definitely want a government to do certain things for me. I mean, I don't want to have to worry about our country not having a border. I don't want to have to worry about, which that's a topic for another show, Justin.
We could go a long time on that topic.
Oh, yeah. I have a feeling the border could be a topic for a couple of hours, especially if we want to get into border security. Oh, boy. And did I mention the word Swiss cheese? But anyway, I mean, I don't want to have to worry about the fact that my money may not be accepted by the merchant down the street because he issues his own currency. I don't want to have to worry about the fact that, the borders. I don't want to have to worry about peace treaties and things like that. That's beyond what I think the everyday citizen wants to deal with. So
sure, and I would agree with that. And I don't necessarily think that these individual groups would have completely disagreed with that. But they saw government as being overly oppressive at the very least, and they really wanted to destroy all those conventions of bureaucracy. And actually, it's interesting too, because at this time, terrorism actually was seen as kind of a noble endeavor. They were almost seen as heroes, this kind of romanticized element, because they were fighting for the people.
So kind of like a Zorro type or Robin Hood type thing.
Kind of, yeah. To destroy the power of the government, the rich, and help the people, give them power back. It wasn't so much. Robin Hood was more about wealth, but this was more about power. But it's the same concept. Yeah, they wanted to break down the government, and they were seen as heroes for this in a lot of ways. Seen as martyrs.
Wow. Now I know modern day terrorists who die in an act of terrorism are definitely seen as martyrs by the people who revere such people, who revere them. I don't think the rest of the world sees them as martyrs, but they are seen by a certain community as martyrs.
Yeah, and a lot of that probably goes back to this element of terrorism being a noble act. It was certainly much more widespread during this anarchist wave, and around the turn of the century, in the 1900s.
So, if that was the turn of the 19th century, has that anarchist wave ever gone away? Have we entered a new wave? So that was what, the first wave or the second wave that we were just talking about?
That's considered the first wave. We're actually currently in what's called the fourth. So we've got a couple others in there as well that we've seen. Okay, waves in general tend to last about 40 to 45 years.
All right, so turn of the 19th century was anarchist. What was the next wave?
Yeah, so around 1920 or so, we're talking around the end of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles comes around. We saw a brief lull where there was peace. But then we started to see a rise in terror again, but it was very different. This wave is called the anti-colonial wave or the nationalist wave. And what we saw here was a rise in terrorist groups that were fighting against what we would probably call their colonial masters, the British Empire, the Ottoman Empire, those type of things. So we saw, Algeria, Greece, Ireland. This is where the IRA pops up as well. The FLN in Algeria. We saw Argentina, Indonesia, Japan, Peru, Sri Lanka. All these groups that were colonized suddenly start fighting against their colonial masters, trying to overthrow that oppressive yoke from a government that was, hundreds of thousands of miles away.
Okay, so what made them different than the anarchist group that didn't want government if they're trying to overthrow an oppressive government? They weren't anti-government per se. They were more anti-foreign government. So you had a group like, we use the IRA as kind of the classic example, that wanted an Irish-led government. And they saw the British as being, this master who was coming in and imposing their will on them that they didn't necessarily agree with. And especially as we saw these traditional empires starting to weaken a little bit after World War II, they were starting to break up a little bit, and these terrorist groups saw it an opportunity to fight for nationalist pride. It was all about independence, not anarchy. They wanted their own governments, not no governments. And so we started to see heroes of this way become national heroes or ethnic heroes, like Michael Collins in Ireland. He's kind of a cult hero for his role in fighting against the British. Right, and for some reason I think his story was told, or maybe it was a different story. There was a movie I watched long time ago, and I caught it, one of those late night oddity movies you don't normally turn on, but it was the only thing on at the time. It was called In the Name of the Father, where this father and son were both sentenced to prison and tortured, and eventually their convictions were overturned. And I don't remember who it was, but like I said, it was very fast.
If I remember right, that was IRA, but it wasn't Michael Collins. It was still a little too late to be him.
Okay.
That was another Irishman, but it's the same concept, the Irish fighting against the British rule.
Right. And it was a fascinating movie. Not to take anything away from it, but like I said, I was amazed at how twisted the system seemed and how little little fight they could have.
Yeah, that's Daniel Day-Lewis, right? If I remember correctly.
I'll tell you what, I'll look it up while we're chatting.
I think that was him in that movie.
All right, so they weren't opposed to government, just foreign government. So the first wave is complete anarchy. The second wave is no foreign government. We want our own government with our own values.
Yeah, it's often called the nationalist wave because it's all about nationalist pride. We're the Irish, we want an Irish government, not some foreign leader making decisions for us.
Okay, that makes sense. So what was the third wave? Or are we not done with the second yet?
Well, actually, there's one other thing with the second wave I wanted to kind of touch on, because this is the time period where we actually started to see the element of nobility disappear.
Okay.
Previously, I mentioned they were seen as kind of martyrs and heroes, and we started to see that in the beginnings of this second wave. But there was a group that was part of the IRA. They were kind of a freedom fighter group within them called the Manchester Martyrs, and they started to actually kill innocent civilians, in particular children, for the very first time. The first time children were ever seen as a target of terror groups. And so this is kind of the time period where we saw that virtue disappear, from the broader community at least.
Okay, yeah, I definitely don't agree with anybody killing children. Children are innocent.
Yeah, so this was kind of the last time that we saw any groups self-identify as terrorists. Previously, people, would happily take on that label because it was seen as a good thing. But since this 1920 to 1960 time period, the word terrorism has taken on kind of a negative connotation, and it's largely because of these nationalist groups, in particular the IRA, that started targeting children and other civilians.
Okay, so the IRA was one of the first groups to actually start to target children. That is scary.
They were. It was. I don't want to overstate it. They didn't do it a lot, but it was kind of the first time we saw that. And previously at this point, because they were so anti-government, most of their targets were government in nature, attacking leaders, attacking officials. But, the second wave, we started to see them attacking civilians because it was all about attrition. If they could impose enough costs on the ruling power of the colonial master, then the master might just say, it's not worth it anymore, we're going to leave. And that's kind of what they were hoping to do. So we saw these targeting of civilians to force the ruling power to just give up and leave.
Okay, so they weren't just targeting to target him. They did at least have a potential end game. But I'm guessing it didn't work for some time.
Yeah, actually, this is the wave that is usually seen as the most successful wave of terror. Terrorists, for the most part, managed to get what they wanted. This is the time where we saw all those global empires start to break up. The British Empire, at one point, they said, the sun doesn't set on the British Empire. They had such a massive territory to themselves, and the Ottomans weren't too far behind, and some of these others as well, the French, the Dutch. But they were already kind of starting to break up since the end of the World Wars, and the terrorists kind of used that as an opportunity to get in there and forcefully break it up. And so for the most part, this is the wave that was seen as the successful wave of terror.
Okay, that's kind of scary in the fact that the first time they start targeting children, they get more successful. I don't know if I like that concept, but I guess everyone always is out to protect the kids.
It is, and we see this as well, and we'll get into this in a second with suicide terrorism, but the more willing you are to do terrible things, the more likely people are to give you what you want. It's this idea of resolve, where we don't like suicide terrorism, we don't like people targeting children, and so we do whatever we can to protect those children. And a lot of times that results in giving them what they want.
I can also see that even in legislation. People say, oh, it's for the kids. It's for the children. It's for this group. And
absolutely.
A lot of times I've seen a lot of crazy legislation passed under the guise of protecting the children. So
absolutely. Yeah, it's something that I think hits at everyone's heart. You want to protect those most vulnerable in society, and that's for the most part children. And so when they started being targeted, even in little bits here and there, it becomes a lot easier for a government to say that this isn't worth it anymore. And like I said, they were already starting to weaken, so it didn't take a whole lot to really push them over the edge and decide to withdraw from some of these territories.
Okay, so they were already kind of behind the eight ball.
A little bit. It was more of an opportunity thing than anything really. They were already starting to see that their grand empires were fracturing.
All right, so, and then the IRA basically just said, well, we'll take advantage of that.
They did, and there's quite a few other places. Algeria, the FLN did the same thing, and we started to see a lot of these kind of groups pop up around the world as well. It was probably the time period where we saw the most widespread terrorism globally.
What's the FLN? You dropped an acronym.
Sorry, yeah. So the FLN is a group out of Algeria. I think it stands for National Liberation Front. It's a socialist political party that was in Algeria, but they kind of started, I want to say in the 50s, as a way to kind of throw off the ruling power. They kind of launched the Algerian War back then, and they've been around. I think they're still around today. I think they actually ruled in Algeria for a little while as well. But they were a group that kind of joined this kind of global widespread movement during this kind of anti-colonial or nationalist wave.
All right. I wasn't familiar with that acronym. That's why, and if I wasn't familiar with it, I can almost guarantee you my listeners aren't either.
Yeah, there's so many groups out there. It's hard to stay up on all of them, but this is one that's famous for being during this time period.
So, now what were you saying before I asked for the acronym definition?
Oh, just this is probably the time period where we saw the most widespread terrorism in terms of being global. All around the world, we started to see these groups pop up. The FLN in Algeria, Argentina, Indonesia, Japan, Peru, Sri Lanka, Ireland, Spain. This is where the Basques in Spain first arose. We started to see this movement spread, especially as they started to see groups be successful at it. If you see one group, successfully kick off their colonial master and gain independence, it makes you a lot more likely to want to do the same thing. And so it became very, very widespread during this time period as well.
All right, that makes sense. If you see one, do one kind of thing.
Exactly. And like I said, being successful makes you more likely to spread as well. It happens in really any field, but also in terrorism.
It does make sense. I mean, you see a successful terrorist attack, can you copy it or reproduce it, and potentially even on a bigger scale?
Yeah, absolutely. So being successful and being global went kind of hand in hand during this kind of 40-year stretch from the 20s to the 60s.
All right, so that brings us up to around the 1960s. So what was the third wave?
So the third wave kind of begins in the 60s with the onset of the Vietnam War.
All right.
And so that's kind of during the 60s and 70s. And what happened here in particular was the Viet Cong. They were a real inspiration for this third wave, which is called the New Left. And they showed a lot of groups that poor technology and being weak can still be effective against the powerful. The Viet Cong were not a very strong, insurgent group, but they were pretty successful in what they managed to do. And so they kind of inspired a lot of kind of left-wing communist-type groups to rise up as well. So we saw a lot of far-left ideologies arise during the kind of 60s to 80s, maybe early 90s as well. Especially when the Vietnam War ended in 75, the PLO kind of emerged. And this is when the Palestinian Liberation Organization kind of became the premier group for training other terrorist organizations around the world. The Soviet Union pretty heavily backed them. And a lot of terrorist groups traveled to train with the PLO during this time period.
All right, so you're saying there were proxy wars with terrorist groups even then?
Absolutely. Traditionally, these are usually found in kind of the affluent Western countries, mostly in Europe, because they were seen as fighting against democracy, fighting against the advancement of capitalism, what they saw as economic exploitation and repression. And so we saw this kind of far left ideology. Usually that means communist, not always, but arise. So we've had the Red Army faction in Germany, the Italian Red Brigades, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, all these groups that the Soviet Union was kind of helping to encourage revolt.
All right. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here. Have you been keeping up on the news lately?
Somewhat, yes. What in particular?
All right. I was thinking of what I saw in the news just the other day. The USS Mason was fired on with missiles launched from Houthi-controlled Yemen. Now, the Houthis are backed by Iran, and the other main element in Yemen is backed by Saudi, which, of course, is a partner to the U.S. So, and then, of course, you've got the whole Syria thing, which that in and of itself we could spend an hour on. So, I mean, are we basically just shifting our proxy wars from A to B? Or is anything actually improving here?
That's a good question. In particular, ever since the U.S. really became the preeminent world power during the world wars, we've seen kind of an increase in these proxy-style battles. I mean, that's what Vietnam was. That's what Korea was. Plenty of other places that we saw civil wars. The U.S. would back one side, the Soviet Union would back the other. And when the Soviet Union fell, the U.S. kind of became the current hegemon. We're the ruling power. But I think as other countries are starting to rise back up, Russia is getting stronger, China's getting stronger, I think we may start to see some of these more proxy wars again. And Syria, I think, is a great example of this, where the U.S. and Russia are kind of sort of fighting on the same side and fighting ISIS, but also on very different sides in terms of Assad versus the rebels.
Oh, yeah. For regular listeners to my show, I routinely cover that topic. And I always say, get out your serious scorecards, because you've got Assad backed by Russia, who is also partnered with Iran. And then you've got China on Assad's side. Then you've got Turkey on our side, but they're also frenemies with Russia because they want to do some economic interests. And Turkey lets us use an airbase. Now, Turkey says Assad should go. We say Assad should go. Assad doesn't really see ISIS as a problem.
It's even more complicated when you throw in groups like the PKK, which is a terrorist group that the U.S. kind of sort of coordinates with on occasion because they happen to also be anti-ISIS.
The Kurds, the Kurds kick tail and don't bother taking names.
Yeah, it's very, very complex. It's a very tangled weave in in Syria right now with alliances on going all directions.
It is very tangled. And do you see, I've been watching the news, and I've kind of been reading tea leaves, and I've put some of this out on air. But in the last 2 to 3 weeks, Russia has said they're not going to stand by the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. They are no longer going to engage in a program that they had been engaging with the U.S. to change their nuclear power plants from high-enriched uranium to low-enriched uranium. And as a reminder, for those of you who don't know, what you put into a nuclear power plant is uranium. What you get out is plutonium. So you put in high-enriched, you get out high-enriched. You put in low-enriched, you get out low-enriched. It's more complicated than that. But that's the real quick, non-scientific thumbnail version. Plutonium is used in bombs, folks. At least more effectively than uranium. You can use uranium, but plutonium is more effective. And so that, and they've also recalled foreign exchange students from certain places, and they've moved more of their air defense missile systems into Syria and announced their presence and said they're even going to potentially shoot down U.S. aircraft. So I'm sitting here going, is Russia trying to start World War III?
I think they're probably testing us right now to see what our resolve is and what our response will be. I'm not sure Russia has the capabilities right now to start a world war, but other than nuclear weapons, which I'm not sure they want to do either. But I think at this point they're testing us. They want to see how far they can push the limits before we snap and fight back.
Really? So you think it's advanced saber rattling? Oh, and the other day, by the way, just for your information, they launched, according to the news, 3 ICBMs in a test launch.
Did they really? I missed that one. That's very interesting. I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, if that isn't saber rattling a la North Korea, I don't know what is.
Well, I think that's also, we read about, them kind of dusting our ships with their planes, flying really, really low over them. I think a lot of that's posturing. They're trying to see how far, or just how much they can get away with.
Oh, it's kind of spooky, to say the least.
It is.
Quite frankly, I don't want to see World War III, and I don't want to wake up one day glowing in the dark.
I don't think any of us want that.
All right, so we're back to the waves of terror. We just discussed the second wave, or were we on the third?
We've moved into the third, this kind of new left, communist, Soviet-backed wave.
Okay.
And it's actually interesting too, because the third wave has a lot in common with that first wave, where we started to see kind of a shift back towards assassinations and targeting leaders of countries. The Italian Red Brigades, kidnapped the Italian Prime Minister. I forget his first name, but Moro was his last name, or Aldo Moro. That was a kidnapping and subsequent execution there. The Sandinistas in Nicaragua actually took their entire Congress hostage temporarily. So we started to see this targeting of leaders again, which we hadn't seen since the first wave.
All right, so what makes this one different from the first, other than the fact it was about 80 years later?
I would say ultimately their goals were very different. This wave was not anarchist. They didn't want to eliminate government. They wanted to install a communist government or some other left-wing ideology. And so they were not interested in destroying the conventions of government per se. They just wanted a different leadership there.
All right.
So actually during this time period, just throw this out there too, we saw a couple other assassinations. I mean, this is where Margaret Thatcher was, where they tried to assassinate her. Where Black September, in Palestine killed the Jordanian prime minister. They tried to kill Jordan's King Hussein. The ETA in Spain, killed the Spanish prime minister. And so we saw this assassination level start to rise again as they started taking out these people who they saw as being kind of capitalist, democratic in nature, that type of thing.
Okay, so even the terrorists were getting more sophisticated.
They were, and we saw their tactics start to change. This time period started to see kind of a theatrical element to their kidnapping as well. They were playing to the media. This is the time period where we saw media explode as well, to be very international and global. And we started to see the terrorists take control of that as well. This was, when they hijacked airlines and things. they would frequently target Americans because the U.S. had the first international media circuit. We had the first media station that was truly international. And so when they hijacked planes, it wasn't that uncommon for them to release non-Americans and then focus on the Americans, because they were playing to this international stage, playing to the media. It was very theatrical, almost dramatic in nature.
I can see that. And even in this day and age, I've got friends who have both U.S. passports and other nationalities, and frequently when outside the country, they will travel on their other nationality passport, even if it's Canadian. Yeah,
absolutely. And certainly some of that ties into things America has done overseas. They don't like us interfering in places. But a lot of it, from the terrorist leadership standpoint, is simply that the U.S. has the most sophisticated media network. If they kidnap an American or do something with an American, that gets more international play than kidnapping another nationality.
So is it in some ways the media's fault that Americans are more targets, or is it just the fact, is it the nature of the beast?
I would argue it's probably more the nature of the beast. There's certainly an argument to be made that the media sensationalizes terrorism a little more than they should, and I completely understand that because they're playing for ratings, so they're going to play up the sensational aspect as well. But at the end of the day, there's not a really better way to go about it, because the media has to report these things too. Ignoring it doesn't make it go away either.
Right. So reporting reporting it's bad, not reporting it's just as bad. All right. Can I ask you to hold your thoughts for just a moment, because we are just a bit past the bottom of the hour, and I want to get to that commercial break.
Absolutely.
You can lay down if you wanna. You can run away if you wanna. Can't pretend that this is totally okay if you wanna. You can play dead if you wanna. Forget what they said if you wanna. Turn your back on the country needing you right now, but I don't wanna.
The following message contains a special offer for listeners of this station. Are you a man over 40? Are you constantly looking for the nearest bathroom? Do you wake up multiple times a night to use the bathroom? Right now, Perfect Prostate is sending out free bottles of their groundbreaking new formula to listeners of this station. Perfect Prostate Formula was developed by medical doctor Mitchell Fleischer, and its ingredients have been clinically studied to reduce your frequent nighttime bathroom visits and promote healthy urine flow. Right now, preferred customers get their first bottle of Perfect Prostate absolutely free. There's nothing to lose. Perfect Prostate is guaranteed to reduce that constant urge to use the bathroom, especially at night, and promote healthy urine flow. Don't wait. Call now for your free bottle. Just pay shipping and processing. Dial 1-800-675-0251. That's 1-800-675-0251. Supplies are limited. One free bottle per household. Call now. Dial 1-800-675-0251. That's 1-800-675-0251.
Individuals and businesses with tax problems, listen carefully. Do you feel like you're losing control over your finances? If you owe over $10,000 in back taxes or have unfiled tax returns, we can help you take back control. The IRS is the largest and most aggressive collection agency in the world, and they can seize your bank account, garnish your paycheck, close your business, and file criminal charges. Take control of your tax problems now by calling the experts at Tax Mediation Services and take advantage of the Fresh Start program and new laws that may allow us to negotiate a settlement for the lowest amount possible. Our team of tax attorneys and enrolled agents can stop collections and get you protected so you can take control of your financial future. Tax Mediation Services is accredited by the Better Business Bureau. Call now for a free case review and a price protection guaranteed quote.
Call Tax Mediation Services now at 800-610-9050. That's 800-610-9050. 800-610-9050.
All writers are prone to becoming so attached to our characters and stories that we struggle to see why a passage may not be working. It takes another set of eyes to help us nurture our writing into full maturity. At Black Wolf Editorial Services, we strive to enable writers to develop and grow, shaping stories into masterpieces that can stand the test of time. Editing services are provided for all genres and all age categories. Services range from critiques of the short story through to the line edits of the full-length novel and copy editing for those preparing for publication. We also offer assistance on generating a writer's bio for your websites as well as help with those book blurbs and promotional material. We won't abandon you to the masses. We want to celebrate with you in your successes. Black Wolf Editorial Services, nurturing your writing into maturity. For a full list of services and prices, visit us at blackwolfeditorial.com.
KLRN Radio has advertising rates available. We have rates to fit almost any budget. Contact us at advertising@klrnradio.com.
This is Slickery Trigger for Rebel Road Tactical. With proper care and feeding, your pistol will be ready when you need it. There to save your life. Shouldn't your gear be that good? Whether you need a holster for comfortable everyday carry or a tough-as-nails holster for your next training course, Rebel Road Tactical has what you need. Check us out on the web at rebelroadtactical.com.
You are listening to KLRN Radio, where liberty and reason still reign.
You can lay down if you wanna. You can run away if you wanna. You can pretend that this is totally okay if you wanna. You can play dead if you wanna. Forget what they said if you wanna. Turn your back on the country needing you right now, but I don't wanna.
Alright, thank y'all for hanging in with me while we paid them bills. Gotta keep those advertisers happy. Now, my guest Justin is still here with us, and we are discussing the media side of terrorism and media sensationalism of terrorism when we went to break. So, the media, I think, does need to cover it as a fact of it is news. And of course, the old saying, if it bleeds, it leads. Now, I have to admit, I've seen less terrorism in the news and more politics lately, which in some ways is equally annoying. Of course, that too shall pass.
Absolutely. I hope so. I'm about tired of the politics and the media right now.
You're not the only one, Justin, and I have a feeling most of my listeners are, and that's why they tune into me, because I cover very little on the side of politics. Alright, so covering it they do sometimes cover it in sensational ways, and the first example that comes to mind in that was when Rolling Stones put Joseph Tsarnaev on a cover.
Mm-hmm.
And
we've definitely seen them play to that sensational aspect.
And I mean, I couldn't have disagreed more with that act. Now, the covering of the Boston Marathon bombing itself and his capture, I had no issue with. That was legitimate news. But when Rolling Stone gave him a cover and put this pretty boy picture of him up, that's where I drew the line. I was like, no.
And they're certainly playing for ratings. They're competing with each other. They're trying to out-sensationalize each other. So you have these kind of outlying cases like the Rolling Stone one, where they're trying to make themselves seem more sensational and draw more readers. It's hard to blame them for that in some ways, but at the same time, giving these terrorists a platform, giving them a face, giving them a name, may not be having the effect that we want.
That is true. That is true. And while I do not try and promote terrorism on my show, I do often discuss it, and I will frequently either not mention the name, or if I do mention the name, I'll use it once, and then therefore, going forward in that show, I will refer to him as the terrorist or the bomber or whatever label fits. But I do try and downplay it, but I do feel it's important to mention the name at least once so that people know who I'm talking about and what I'm talking about.
It is. It's important, but it's a fine line to walk. Where do you draw the line between reporting truth and accurate facts, but also giving too much of a platform? It's not an easy line to walk. I don't envy people who have to make those decisions.
Well, that's the line. That's how I've chosen to walk the line. I'll mention the name once in the story, and then I will go on and refer to them as the terrorist did XYZ. The terrorist did this. This was the aftermath of the terrorist acts. That's how I tend to walk it. So, personal opinion here. All right, so we saw these hijackings, and I believe we're now in the 70s. Am I correct?
Right, kind of the 60s, the 70s, maybe early 80s. We're starting to see this.
In those days when a plane was hijacked, you were probably going to live unless you were an idiot.
Right.
Unless you were one of the unfortunate few that got killed to make a point, or you were acted out. Chances are you were going to live through that hijacking. That wasn't
right. A lot of it was simply ransom that they wanted, to be given something. Once they were given it, they released people.
That wasn't the case on a fateful day in September.
No, it was not, and that's probably where we see the final wave really take off, which is called the religious wave.
Care to expound on that?
Yeah.
Because it just seems like every time I hear terrorism nowadays, there's a religious component to it.
It is, and it's probably started in the late 70s, maybe early 80s, as the third wave was kind of winding down. But 9/11 in this country really sparked it, and that's when it's really taken off in the last, about 15 years. And to the point where if you ever hear of a terrorist attack, how often do you hear of a terror attack that's not religious in nature today? It's pretty rare.
I can't recall the last one that wasn't religious of somewhere in it. You'll find even the Palestinians, they're fighting against the Jews, and they make it known that to them it's a religious war.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then there's the term
very,
jihad.
Very common nowadays.
Then there's the term jihad, which I don't know an American who follows the news who doesn't know that term that means religious war, religious fighter, or depending on context.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a couple groups out there. The ETA still exists. The PKK is not really religious. They're more ethnic-based than anything, but it's hard to find an active group today that doesn't have a heavy religious component.
And, of course, there's the PKK's brother organization, the YPG.
Mm-hmm.
So just want to make sure they get their mention, too. That's another Kurdish group.
Right.
So, in fact, some U.S. military members got in trouble for wearing, I think it was YPG patches on their uniforms.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Came out on social media. Just goes to show the world's always watching what the U.S. service member does.
They really are. And that's precisely why terrorists target U.S. service members and others. They're the ones who show up in the news.
So going back down the military road, where would the Beirut bombing of the Marine barracks fit in?
That's... What year was that in? That would be 82? 83 maybe?
I was going to say, I was thinking early to mid-80s.
Yeah, so I would argue that's probably in the very beginnings of this religious wave. If I remember correctly, there was a group calling themselves Islamic Jihad that claimed responsibility, but I don't know specifically much about that group to say for sure. I believe though that was kind of the beginnings of this religious wave of terror.
All right, so that was the early stages. Because I remember also at the same time frame, William Buckley was captured. He was a United States official. And he was definitely, his capture and execution was definitely widely broadcast in certain circles.
Right.
Right around the same time as the Beirut bombing. But then it culminated, I believe, in the 9/11 tower attacks. Right,
and that's where we really see this modern wave of terror take off dramatically.
So what makes these modern terrorists do what they do? Can you explain that for us? Because that is a puzzle I have been trying to wrap my head around for some time, Justin.
Yeah, there's not a particularly easy answer to this. I would say, prior to this point, the aim of most terrorist groups was to create secular states. But when we saw the Iranian Revolution in the 70s and we saw the Afghan-Soviet War, we saw a religious group, the Afghans, kick out a secular major superpower. And I think at that point, that war sparked a lot of people that said, hey, religion defeated secularism, even when, the secularist power was one of the two greatest superpowers in the world. And so it gave some sort of legitimacy to this kind of religious nature. And I think a lot of times religion is something that's kind of very deeply held by a lot of people. Whatever religion they are, it's something that really speaks to the heart of who that person is. And I think religion drives people to do things that your average, say, political position isn't going to. Now, why they do what they do gets very, very tricky. But I think we see people much more willing to fight for faith, to fight for religion, than they are to fight for, their own state on average, at least in the last 20-odd years.
Right. So is it particularly devout members of the religion or what? And just for your information, the Beirut barracks bombing that I referenced was October 23rd, 1983.
Okay.
So
that was during the Lebanese Civil War.
Yes, it was in Lebanon, in Beirut, Lebanon.
Well, that's actually another spark for a lot of the religious terrorism day, because eventually Israel left Lebanon, and that was seen as a victory for some of these religious-based groups as well.
So I didn't realize Israel had been in Lebanon. I guess I haven't gotten quite enough history under my belt.
Yeah, I think they invaded kind of southern Lebanon in '82, and it became known as kind of the Lebanon War. I don't have a whole lot of background in that area, but they were in southern Lebanon for a year or so before, led by the PLO, I think, and some other groups. They eventually left, and it was seen as kind of this big victory for them.
All right, that kind of makes sense. So, like I said, I just figured I'd look that up for you because I brought it up.
Oh, I appreciate it. Yeah, that was definitely part of this religious wave. Then, if it was tied to the Lebanon War.
It was, and it said the likely chain of command, and this is according to Wikipedia, ran from the government of Iran to Iran's ambassador to Syria, to Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and Hezbollah.
Yeah.
And last I checked, Hezbollah is definitely one of those terrorist groups.
They are, yeah. They're actually one of the strongest terrorist groups relative to their state government as well. A lot of people think Hezbollah is actually stronger than the current Lebanese military.
Really?
Yeah, it's one of the few cases where the terrorist group may actually be stronger than the state in which they're located.
Wow, that's scary. It really is. And it just amazes me when you get into certain aspects of terrorism. It's like, okay, look at the city of Jerusalem. And having Yom Kippur just passed and being Jewish, the Temple Mount is probably the most fought over, I'm going to say, piece of real estate in the world. Everybody wants to claim it. Everybody wants to claim this thing. And I can't think of another piece of real estate on this planet that can get that many people worked up that quickly.
It's definitely up there. It's very hotly contested by at least 3 different religious groups and countless millions of people around the world.
Exactly. I mean, you've got the Jews, the Muslims, and I believe the Christians would be the third. Correct
Absolutely.
me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, all 3 draw some level of claim to that small piece of real estate.
From that will be covered on another show another time, folks. So if you're not up on the Temple Mount, don't worry about it. I'll get to it eventually. I'll put it in my get around to it file. And I do actually write these ideas down. I just don't always get around to them as quickly as I'd like. But so now that we've entered the religious wave of terrorism, do you want to go out on a limb and kind of read the tea leaves? What do you think is going to be the next wave? Any thoughts on what the 5th wave is going to look like, or what base it's going to have?
Yeah, I think, well, there's been several attempts at guessing it. Historically, we've seen these waves last about 40 to 45 years. This one started in the 80s. So we're actually kind of in the later stages of this wave, if it follows previous wave patterns. Personally, I think what we're going to see next is kind of a shift in strategy to become more global. We started to see this kind of at the end of the third wave when it became more international, but with ISIS or Daesh or whatever, in particular, we've seen terrorist groups want to create their own states. I think that may end up being kind of the next model that we see following, where they're seeking almost state-like control of regions. ISIS is unlike anything that we've seen before in that sense. And I think that may be the next move of terror, kind of state-like power.
Okay.
It's hard to know for sure, but that would be my best guess.
So if terrorists get their own states, I guess in one aspect it would be a good thing because it'd make it easier for countries such as ourselves or other Western powers to actually officially declare war on them. Because right now they're non-state actors; they're kind of hard to pin down.
Yeah, it's hard to track down a group that's not location-based necessarily.
I find that interesting. Now, I will grant you, I don't want to see a terrorist state. We have enough of them on the planet. Just look at
and once you grant legitimacy to a terror group by giving them statehood, that's got to encourage others as well. I don't necessarily think that's in our best interest overall to start granting that legitimacy to them.
Nor do I. So, we're in the fourth wave. You think, assuming it follows pattern, we're on the downhill side of it. Do you see the attacks getting more brutal, less brutal? I mean,
well, I think they're getting more brutal over time. Particularly in this religious wave, we've seen kind of a rise in suicide terrorism, which actually, interestingly, it was inspired by a group that was not religious in nature in Sri Lanka called the Tamil Tigers, or LTTE. But the suicide terrorism has become almost exclusively religious in nature since that time. And I think we're starting to see more and more brutal attacks as they start to try to ramp up and, again, play this kind of sensational method. And we're starting to see them kind of trying to one-up each other in a sense as well. It plays to the media. It plays to the people. It's a way to get your cause out there, your ideology out there. And we're starting to see them videotape a lot of this stuff. Obviously, we talked last time about how they videotape a lot of their torture and beheadings that are getting more and more brutal. They have to do more to shock people, to show them that we're capable of this. You really should be afraid of us. Because at the end of the day, the ultimate goal of terrorism, almost by definition, is fear. If you can maintain fear, in a population, then you have control of them. And it's hard to maintain fear without constantly upping, the level of brutality and violence.
I can agree with that one. Now, I will say, do you think the fact that they have to keep upping the ante, and this goes back to a bit of psychology, which thankfully you have a much better background than I do in it, do you think in part that's due to the level of violence the average American is already exposed to in the movies, in the video games, in the news, and all that? The fact that it takes more and more violent acts?
I think that is certainly possible. I'm not particularly aware of any studies that show that, specifically, but I think you'd be hard pressed to argue against the claim that we are more sensationalized, more inoculated against violence today than we ever have been. In particular, with the media, something happens, let's say in Sri Lanka, I can hear about it in my pocket in seconds and watch a video of a riot taking place if I wanted to. It's much easier for us to get our hands on these violent actions. Again, that's not necessarily the media's fault. That's kind of their job, but I think you'd be hard pressed to argue against that possibility that our inoculation to violence is playing into their desire to become more and more brutal.
I had to ask that one. I had to go there, folks, because you look at the amount of violence that your average 13 to 15-year-old has already seen in the form of video games, news, movies, And yeah, I know you technically have to be 17 or 18 to get into an R or X-rated film, or R-rated. We're not going to discuss X-rated, thank you. To get into an R-rated film, but then eventually these things all come out on cable, and there's nothing on that cable box unless your parents are smart enough to activate parental controls, and most of you are smart enough to steal the password.
Yeah.
So it's not to mention everything on the internet. I mean, there are entire websites dedicated to nothing more than violence, graphic acts of violence.
Absolutely, it's become very widespread.
So, you think in the next wave it's going to be just as graphic, more graphic?
I think there's a good chance that it's going to be even more so as they try to push their limits. I think there has to be a ceiling on it at a certain point, because when you reach a certain point of violence, you're really forcing the hand of other states. And let's take ISIS for example. Right now, I think they're really on the verge right now of losing in a lot of ways, because they've pushed past their capabilities. You know, the attacks in Paris, for instance, personally, I think were kind of a reach for them. I don't think they should have been involved in there from their perspective, because what it did is it angered the French, and they're not capable of handling, you know, a full Western assault. And when you start angering Western nations like that without having the personal capabilities to handle the repercussions, you know, that's really dangerous for the group. And so I think there is a ceiling to it at a certain point, where it will force the hand of countries like the U.S. and France and Britain and some of these others. And I think that it's something that, from a terrorist perspective, they're trying to be really careful about. Because if they do overstep their bounds, then it may backfire on them.
Do you actually think they care?
I do. Not maybe in the way that we typically think about it, but at the end of the day, they want to survive. They want to be around. They want to bring about the apocalypse we've talked about before. I think if they push things too far, that hurts their long-term goals. But at the same time, ISIS is kind of a unique case where they're, you know, actively trying to bring about the apocalypse. So it's hard to say for sure. Historically, I know Al Qaeda, you know, went through this a little bit, where they have to balance their physical capabilities to handle repercussions with their goals. I mean, if you think about 9/11 in a lot of ways, and the attack here, but it was massively devastating for Al Qaeda. I mean, we've killed or captured, I think, their top 30 to 35 leaders since that point. They've lost a ton of power in the area. The Taliban, as well as an example, they were ruling Afghanistan for years, and they overstepped their bounds by harboring bin Laden, and now in the last couple of years they've started to gain power again. But they were kicked out of power in Afghanistan and driven into the mountains, lost huge amounts of territory and leaders, and that was because they kind of overstepped their bounds in a lot of ways. And so ISIS, it's hard to know for sure, but I know historically terrorist groups have tried to be careful about that, and several of them have gone too far and incurred the wrath of other countries.
So at what point do you think the countries just decide enough's enough? We're going to give you what you want. You want annihilation? Here it comes. At what point what do you think it's going to take before there's a true Western coalition, uprising, revolt, and just an all-out slaughter of a group such as ISIS?
You know, that's a good question, and I'm not 100% certain, because personally I would have thought we'd have already reached there. When you look at some of the pictures of things going on in Syria, you know, you see some of these videos, you hear some of the stories. I would have thought we'd already passed that, and we clearly haven't. So I'm not sure what more it would take at this point. Maybe attacks on their own soil, you know, as France saw. I mean, if they start attacking more internationally, that would, you know, show countries that this is not just a Middle Eastern fight; it's a global fight. We're starting to see that a little bit in China. You know, China for years was very hands off when it came to terrorism. But in their Uyghurs province, out in kind of the western part of the country, they've started to see a rise in terrorism. And there's a couple small groups there that have pledged allegiance to ISIS, and are trying to do the same concepts, kind of an Islamic State of China. And we started to see China start to take more action against it. And so maybe that's what it takes is, you know, acts within that country to show that it's you know, hey, this is not just a Middle Eastern fight. But again, it's hard to know. I would have thought we'd been past this line a while back.
Oh, yeah. I don't know if you've heard this little bit of news. You know I scour the web for my news. ISIS is now starting to use drones. Now, we're not talking highly sophisticated predator type. We're talking off-the-shelf drones that anybody can buy, and they're arming them and turning them into flying IEDs.
Fortunately, it doesn't surprise me, but there's only a matter of time. But that is still a whole other method that we need to be cautious with over there.
Right. It's mostly been seen in and around Mosul as everyone's ramping up to take back Mosul.
Mm-hmm.
But there were already 2 people that were killed because they were trying to disarm one of these flying drones, and 2 more wounded. So it was 2 French EOD, I believe, were wounded, and I believe it was 2 Afghan, but don't quote me, that were killed. I just keep wondering, what is it going to take to get us over this edge where we just say, enough is enough? We're going to take every last one of you out. And while I never want to see a nuclear war, I hate to say it may be coming.
Yeah, it's certainly a difficult topic. I mean, nuclear war, I don't see us entering it or starting one at this point. It's kind of a nuclear taboo. But you have groups like ISIS that are noted for trying to get their hands on these things because they don't care about suicide like a state would. And there's a reason the Kim family in North Korea is never going to drop a nuclear bomb because they, as crazy as they are, they're not suicidal. But a terrorist group might be suicidal, and if they are able to get their hands on something, that could potentially trigger something much larger. And I should mention too at this point, it's not just Islamist-based groups that are doing this. I mean, there was a Japanese group called Aum Shinrikyo a few years ago. They're the ones who are famous for the sarin gas attacks in Tokyo.
Right.
But
right.
We know that they were trying to get their hands on nuclear bomb materials as well, and they're a very unusual religious group. But it's not just a Middle Eastern problem with terrorist groups.
What religious group are they? Can you expound on them a little bit? Because I knew about the sarin attacks, but I never quite knew about the group behind them.
Yeah, so Aum Shinrikyo is kind of a Japanese doomsday cult. Officially, I think it translates to something along the lines of Universal Religion of Truth or something to that effect. But they're actually kind of a weird group. They started as a yoga class of all things. But they gained status as a religious organization in the late 80s in Japan.
Okay, so yoga class to terrorist group, that's got to be a leap.
It was unusual, yeah. They were kind of a yoga meditation class. And actually, it gets even weirder. They spread their ideology through comic strips, manga, cartoons, and so the dangers of yoga and cartoons, I guess. But they morphed into this kind of religious terrorist group that's a weird mix of kind of Indian and Tibetan Buddhism. They mixed in Hinduism, yoga, like the religion yoga, not the exercise. Nostradamus' predictions are mixed in, and they were very heavy on kind of the Christian Book of Revelation and the Bible as well. Their leader claimed to be the Christ as well as the Buddha, and so they were very focused on doomsday. They claimed there was going to be a World War III, very conspiracy driven. So they're a very weird group. But they were very wealthy as well, and they had AK-47s. They had a Russian Mi-17 helicopter at their compound. Nobody's quite sure how they got back. They were trying to acquire nuclear bomb materials, and they're most famous for sarin gas. The kill that was 13 back in '95 in Tokyo. They're a very unusual group.
I believe it was 13, but yeah, that and sarin gas. For those that don't know, do you know the background on sarin gas or anything about it as a WMD?
A little bit. I don't know a whole lot of details behind it.
I'm just going to go in the thumbnail basics here. It's highly toxic. Mm-hmm. You have a very short period of time. It's right up there with VX. You have a very short period of time to get to clean air. And then you still may not survive depending on your level of exposure.
Yeah, I mean, I think it only killed 13, but over 1,000 people were affected in some way from this. it spread very rapidly as a nerve agent.
Looking up the details now. Thank you, CDC.
Yeah. If I remember right, when the government ultimately raided their compound, they found enough sarin gas to kill 4 million people. So they were clearly planning a lot more than what they had released, which actually indicates that the 95 attack was probably a test run for them, more than anything else.
Okay, according to the CDC, aka the Center for Disease Control. If anyone ever gets a hold of my search history, they will think I'm a terrorist. But I'm not, I promise. Alright, sarin is a human-made chemical warfare agent classified as a nerve agent. Alright, it is clear, colorless, odorless, tasteless in its pure form. However, it can evaporate into gas and spread into the environment. It is also known as GB. It is not naturally found. It is man-made. It was used in 2 terrorist attacks in 1994 and 1995. Sarin mixes easily with water. A person's clothing can release sarin after it has come in contact with sarin vapor. Sarin is heavier than air. It will sink to low-lying areas. Even a small drop of sarin on the skin can cause sweating and muscle twitching where sarin touched the skin. Let's see. I'm looking to see, obviously, the treatment is decontamination. I don't think we need to go there.
I believe when you inhale it, too, it essentially paralyzes your lung muscles, which is why, it's so deadly.
Let's see. Immediate symptoms of sarin: runny nose, watery eyes, pinpoint pupils, eye pain, blurred vision, drooling, coughing, chest tightness, rapid breathing, diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, confusion, drowsiness, weakness, headache, slow or fast heart rate, high or low blood pressure, large amounts of sarin, loss of consciousness, convulsions, paralysis, respiratory failure. Doesn't say it's a paralytic, but I'm not going to say it's not. And like I said, this is just the basics by the CDC. And trust me, they don't want to give you too much because they don't want you figuring out how to make it more effective.
Yeah, it was. It's a very lethal agent.
It was originally developed in 1938 in Germany as a pesticide. And it does say here, however, nerve agents are much more potent than phosphate pesticides. And its nerve agents are the most toxic, rapidly acting of the known chemical warfare agents. So you can be exposed to any number of ways as usual. All nerve agents cause their toxic effects by preventing proper operation of an enzyme that acts as the body's off switch for glands and muscles. Without an off switch, the glands and muscles are constantly being stimulated. Exposed people may become tired and no longer able to keep breathing. So what it does is it actually puts your muscles and everything into hyperdrive.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Because then you breathe in even more of the stuff.
Yeah, and it happens very quickly. It's you can die in, I think, less than 10 minutes, depending on how much you inhale. I want to say it's like 20 times more deadly than cyanide, which is usually what we think of as being this deadly chemical. But sarin is way more deadly than cyanide is, especially as a gas form.
I am looking to see if I can find... Death may follow in 1 to 10 minutes after direct inhalation of a lethal dose, unless antidotes including atropine and pyrrolidoxime are quickly administered. It is 26 more times approximately than cyanide.
26, yeah. It's a very deadly nerve agent. And that was essentially the main weapon of choice for this particular religious group in Japan. Interestingly, this group has actually seen a bit of a resurgence recently in other countries. There was a raid back in Montenegro in March. They kicked out 58 people they kicked them out of the country for being suspected associates of this Aum Shinrikyo group. Russia also apparently has quite a few people as well that are at least sympathetic to this cause.
Scary. And by the way, for anybody playing Follow the Resources, the last couple facts about sarin, we're from Wikipedia, not the CDC. Gotta look in multiple places, folks. Gotta look in multiple places. I always like to let them know where I got my facts, so if they want to fact check me, Justin, they're more than welcome to.
Oh, absolutely. And Wikipedia may not be the best source, but they are heavily sourced down at the bottom. You can see where they got all their information from. It's kind of more of a secondary source than anything, but it's you can get a lot of great information there.
especially if you verify the sources at the bottom, which I did quick scroll down on that one. On the 1 to 10 minute thing, I did actually quick scroll down, and it was a reliable enough appearing source, so I went with it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The Wikipedia probably doesn't deserve the poor reputation it has when it comes to sourcing. It certainly can be wrong, but they tend to do a pretty decent job with referencing things.
Exactly, and what I like about Wikipedia is they'll tell you at the top if a page is not well sourced. They'll tell you right at the outset, hey, this is a little fishy here, folks.
Yeah, as long as you approach Wikipedia skeptically, it's usually a pretty solid source. I look
at Wikipedia as like I look at news aggregate sites. It pulls everything together. It's up to me to determine whether the credibility of each source they used.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
But if I need a quick fact, like when was the Beirut barracks bombing? They probably got that one right, folks.
Absolutely. It's not a source that I would ever allow my students to use in class, but the sources that Wikipedia uses at the bottom usually are pretty solid.
Right. And it's often a good, okay, where do I even start with this topic source? When you're going, okay, I don't know the first thing about fill in the blank. It's a great beginner learning place. And then you can go down to the bottom and go into some of the more in-depth sources and get the real information you need. But sometimes when you just need a quick overview about what is it, it's not a bad spot.
Yeah, absolutely. It does a good job of gathering information from a lot of different places.
Like I said, I view it as an aggregate source. And the 1 to 10 minutes were from Poisonous Affair, American Iraq and the Gassing of Halajaba, Poisonous by Joost R. Hilterman. And that was published in Cambridge University Press. That's a source I trust.
That's a pretty solid one. Cambridge is a trustworthy source for the most part.
Exactly. That's where I went, yeah, I'll run with that. It's backed by Cambridge. So even when I'm flying to look up a fact online, I do try and fact check it, and not just go with what Wikipedia says. I'll at least pull up the little footnote and go, where did they get that from? And if I see a reputable publisher or a reputable name I recognize, I'll run. Otherwise, I may skip over it and say I'll have to look that up and get back to you.
Yeah, that makes sense.
All right, so obviously they're going to max out on the amount of graphic and gratuitous violence they can use. What's going to be their next thing?
Oh, I'm not sure I even want to start speculating down that path. But I think we're going to see this kind of push to become more and more state-like in nature, because regardless of whatever tactics they use, the best thing a terrorist group can have going for it is international legitimacy. And so if they can act as a state, and they can even convince other states to start to recognize them as a legitimate government, and that's the best thing any sort of cause can have. The Taliban taking power in Afghanistan for a decade or more was I think very emblematic of this. They managed to essentially rule a country for 10 plus years. And while not too many other countries officially recognized them, they started to get a couple. Pakistan recognized them, the UAE did, Saudi Arabia recognized them, at least temporarily.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't the Palestine Liberation Organization recognized as the ruler of the of West Bank and Gaza?
Well, that's a really good question, because currently the Palestinian territories are kind of split. The West Bank is essentially run by the PLO, and I think it's called the Fatah Party. But Gaza is actually run by Hamas. The PLO doesn't have much say there.
All right, well, back down that line. Isn't the PLO recognized by the UN?
I would have to go to the UN to make sure. They are...
Hang on. Going there now.
Not recognized, I don't think, as legitimate as, say, a traditional government would be, but they have...
No, but they have a seat. Palestine has
some sort of representation there, yes. Palestine does. It's hard to know if that indicates any sort of legitimacy on the PLO specifically. The Palestinian territories, I think they raised a flag there for Palestine or something to that effect. It's pretty nominal at this point, but it's more than most groups have. Now, of course, Palestinian territories are not run purely by these two terrorist groups. There are certainly other non-terrorist entities there as well who are much more peaceful. But for a long time, they were essentially run by the PLO, and now that Hamas has taken over in Gaza, at least.
Right. I'm looking to see the details on the UN website right now about Palestine. So give me just a second here. Of course, Palestine's all over the UN website.
Yeah, I believe. I guess I have no idea if the UN specifically does. I think they voted to recognize it a couple of years ago, but something like 70% of the countries in the world do recognize the state of Palestine. Out of the 193, I think, in the world, like 130 or so do. But that's, again, not quite the same thing as recognizing a terrorist group as a legitimate government either.
Right. It does give them some credence when they can say, well, we've got a seat at the UN.
It does, absolutely. And I think that's what we're seeing with ISIS, too, not necessarily looking for seats at the UN, but looking for this international legitimacy as, hey, treat us like a state.
Well, ISIS has issued its own currency, does try and enforce its own laws. I may not agree with those laws, but it does try and enforce them.
They do. They're acting more and more like a state because they want that international legitimacy. So, as you just mentioned, they offer their own currency. They operate their own laws. They have justice systems in place. They have welfare systems in place. They offer all kinds of social services, hospitals, schools, all of these things that a state typically would provide. And it's done to not only gain public support, from the average citizen in that area, but to show internationally that they aren't just all about violence, that they have an element of legitimacy that it puts them on par with other states. I don't think it's in our good interest to legitimize that, but that's, I think, what their ultimate goal is.
Right. I'm trying to find this information. Of course, the first link at the UN didn't work, so we'll have to work on that one in a minute. But they do work off the Israeli shekel, and the Egyptian pound, and the Jordanian dinar, so they do not have their own currency.
I believe have they tried to institute their own?
They've tried and failed, yeah.
Yeah, I thought so. Okay.
And the Palestinian government. Whole other kettle of creatures. It's the Palestinian National Authority that has a seat at the UN.
Okay, yeah, that's kind of a different organization. That's somewhat related to some of the other groups, but they're a different organization entirely.
But they also are, of course, tied in with the PLO.
They are. I mean, the PLO was in power there for so long, it'd be hard not to be tied in with them. They really only lost power in 2006 or so.
When Arafat
when Hamas gained control in the Palestine's legislative council. So the PLO lost a lot of power back in 2006.
Yeah, the Oslo Accords were good, and Arafat was a good participant, and then it all kind of went south from there.
Yes, yeah, they've lost a lot of that power.
They have. Well, I think that's enough on Palestine. I will look up those facts and get back to you folks. I will add it in. We may have to discuss Palestine on another episode, Justin.
That would be a fascinating talk.
Because I have a feeling we could go on for some time with a little bit of prep and research there.
Absolutely.
All right, so are there any aspects of the four waves and upcoming fifth wave of terrorism that you wanted to touch on we didn't get to?
Well, I think the only thing that's kind of left is even though we've seen kind of a rise in international terrorism, I think it's important to note that even today, 90% plus of terrorism still takes place domestically. It's a very high percentage, and it's really mostly in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and now Syria. It's still very heavily based in that area, despite this kind of rise in international terrorism. I mean, the U.S. is now the primary enemy of a lot of groups in name, but practically speaking, most of the terrorism still takes place in 3 or 4 countries.
I think that is a very valid point, and also I'm going to remind people that your average victim of terrorism, it is Muslim on Muslim.
Absolutely. There's a lot of infighting between groups, and the average victim of terrorism today is other Muslims. And when you have these Islamist-based groups, they are seeking to oust those who they see as not true Muslims, from their area, and so they frequently kill, torture, uproot other people in these 3 or 4 countries.
All right, well, Justin, as we end every episode, would you like to give out your social media and any other contact information today?
Yeah, absolutely. Social media, the best way to reach me is probably through Twitter. I have 2 different accounts. One is my personal account, Justin_Kinney. And then I also have an author account. I've mentioned on previous talk, I'm an author. I have a book that's out called Precipice. It's available on Amazon. And I have a Twitter account associated with that as well. That's J. Robert Kinney. And that's really the best way to reach me.
And for those of you who are listeners to my other show, Jesse's Coffee Shop, yes, I'm planning on getting Justin as an author on Coffee Shop. We were going to discuss it after we get off the air. I've actually had 2 emails on that one asking when I'm going to have you on Coffee Shop, Justin.
I'm looking forward to doing that.
All right. And as all of you know, you can find me on Twitter at Jesse's POV. You can find my website at jessespov.com. You can find my coffee shop show, jessescoffeeshop.com. I'm even on Facebook. Of course, Jesse's POV. No, Coffee Shop doesn't yet have a Facebook page. Sorry, folks. It's a once-a-month show. Cut me some slack. And you can always email me at jessespov@klrnradio.com. And I can be frequently found hanging out in the chat room at KLRN Radio, either during my show or other shows. And thank you very much, and y'all have an outstanding day. And on that note, I'm out of here!